Tim DeChristopher is best known for sabotaging an auction of oil and gas leases on federal land back in 2008, for which he went to federal prison for 21 months. In the period since, Tim's helped found a couple of organizations, Peaceful Uprising and the Climate Disobedience Center, that are dedicated to supporting voluntary, peaceful, direct action around the climate crisis. He also attended Harvard Divinity School and has studied to become a masseuse, so a guy with eclectic interests and skills. Thank you for joining us, Tim, in Crazy Town. I think that you probably have lived in this town for a long time, but appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Sure. And so, I reached out because I wanted to talk to you about climate disobedience and specifically the prospect of like sabotage. And by that, I mean like the destruction of private property, destruction of infrastructure. But before we get into kind of the larger conversation around that, I just thought it might be useful for folks watching or listening for you just to share a little bit of your own experience with direct action and climate disobedience. Would that be okay?
Sure. Yeah. I think my experience has been mainly in the paradigm of civil disobedience, of taking actions which might have to be organized in secret in order to pull them off sometimes, but with the intention generally of being open, of taking credit for it, and in particular the sort of niche that I ended up playing in a lot of the movement, and that the Climate Disobedience Center has fulfilled in a lot of the movement is working with defense trials around civil disobedience to use the trial as an organizing opportunity to tell this public story, and kind of doing direct action that has some direct impact on the industry, whether that's delaying things, costing them money, but doing it with an emphasis on trying to maximize the symbolic impact as well, and right. Trying to have an impact on the cultural narrative at the same time. And I think where the line there with more sabotage type actions is, I think there's much more of an emphasis on the direct impact, and oftentimes, particularly with the legal risk of it, it means not being public about it, trying to not get caught, so there's a little bit of a fine line there, with some overlap.
So, using this disobedience, this direct action, as opportunity for garnering attention to the climate crisis. I mean, that is, I think, what happened in your case. I don't know that you intended what wound up happening, right? In terms of all the attention that was focused on your trial, but would you say
not
you
exactly,
sort
but
of
in
learned
some
through
ways.
that process? Okay.
Yeah,
Maybe you can say more about that then.
Yeah, I mean, I did have the intention at the time of being very public about it and having it have a public impact, having it have a ripple impact on the broader climate and environmental movement, and on the people who cared about climate change. And that was successful. But part of that impact is that the context around direct action and civil disobedience, particularly in the climate movement, has shifted a lot over that past almost 15 years now. That at that time, part of the reason that my story became as big as it did was that there wasn't very much of that happening in the climate movement, and a lot of people were really hungry for it. The movement was much more focused on appeasement at that time, and a lot of people were hungry for something more confrontational.
Mm-hmm.
And over the past decade or more, um, there's been a much broader embrace of direct action and of civil disobedience. Um, and it's not front page news every time somebody gets arrested for direct action anymore. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's extremely commonplace, and so that's part of what shifts the kind of cost benefit there. That the symbolic impact of just getting arrested for something you believe in um, is much smaller at this point right now than it was 10 or 15 years ago. So that makes that makes civil disobedience a lot less impactful on the uh, on the culture change side of things.
What about in terms of within sort of the judicial branch within the court system? Because you talked a little bit about the Climate Disobedience Center, helping with trials, right? I mean, is there a shift there from it being a sort of like a public attention thing to trying to actually challenge within the judicial system?
Yeah, but I would say there's two shifts going on. One is the shift that we've been trying to drive towards um, opening up the opportunities for folks to be able to present their whole defense, particularly the necessity defense or some sort of
Mm-hmm.
affirmative defense that says, yes, I did this, and here's why it was necessary. Here's why the climate crisis is so severe and the government's response is so inadequate that it necessitates this kind of action. And that has been a frustrating process of kind of chipping away at all the barriers to a defendant being able to actually speak freely in a courtroom and
Mm-hmm.
really mount a full defense. Um, and we've gotten partial necessity defenses and partial victories, and continue to try to open that up a little bit more. But then at the same time, there's been this other courtroom trend where our opponents have been trying to increase the criminalization of nonviolent direct action,
Mm-hmm.
and we've seen that particularly with the critical infrastructure bills that have been passed in a lot of states that make it a serious felony to be trespassing on the property of a piece of fossil fuel infrastructure, or blockading the entrance to it and things like that. And so we're kind of on the defensive in that way,
Mm-hmm.
of trying to fight off this increased criminalization of nonviolent direct action. Which again changes the cost benefit analysis for the, that kind of tactic. That um, you know the the industry is trying to make it look like if somebody is interfering with business by blockading the entrance to a facility or something, that they should be treated in the court system like they're you know somebody who was blowing up the pipeline. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so if that's going to be the case, I think there's going to be more and more people saying, well, if I'm going to be facing those kind of charges, maybe I should do something at that level. If I'm
Right.
if I'm already going to be treated that way by the court system, I might as well take out some infrastructure with me.
Yeah. So speaking of pipelines, right? Andrea's mom wrote a book provocatively titled "How to Blow Up a Pipeline." It's not really. I didn't find it to actually be a manual for how to blow up a pipeline, but in that
That
book,
was a
and I know you
disappointment,
wrote a,
right?
yeah, I know you wrote a review of it. But in that book, essentially, he argues for sabotage, right? For the destruction of property and of infrastructure. I think he is pushing against what he sees within the climate activist movement, uh, an adherence to nonviolence
Hmm.
at sort of at all costs, and and argues that I think that there have been people who have studied and put out arguments saying that it's really only nonviolent civil disobedience that actually leads to change, and he's argued against that in the sense that it takes a myriad of approaches. And before, I'd love to talk to you about sort of your own views on this, but before we do that, I guess I just want to. I've been puzzled for a long time as to why we haven't seen more of this, and again, I'm speaking from my experience, not someone who's been part of discussions of people who have been contemplating doing these things. And the world is a big place, and we don't always hear everything, right? But at least from my perspective, I've not seen much of this at all coming from the climate camp, even as the climate situation becomes more and more dire, and as the international response becomes more and more blatantly pathetic, right? So I'm just curious, one, do you share that kind of perception that this is like a surprise on some level that this hasn't happened, and why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely share that surprise, and for 15 years, I've been shocked every day that young people are not burning something down,
Mm-hmm.
in defense of their own future. Um, but I do think there's a lot of reasons for that. That I think a big part of it has to do with the way that the climate movement kind of has a tendency to lie to itself,
Hmm.
and
In
it's
what
kind
way?
of resistant to the full truth. Um, you know, Part of it has been, this clinging to a hope that things can be okay, or that we're not really that late in the game. That we can still turn things around through these legal channels, without really grappling with like what it means to be this late in the game of climate change. One of the
Mm-hmm.
things that pushed me into action, or into the degree of action, the radicalness of action that I was taking, at that auction in 2008, was that at the beginning of that year, at a big climate conference at the University of Utah, Dr. Terry Root, who was one of the lead IPCC authors of the fourth report in 2007, was there, and I went up and talked to her after her presentation and questioned her about some of the graphs that she was showing, where they showed these emission scenarios of the 21st century of like all their possibilities, with like going off the charts of in business as usual, and ones where we turned it around,
Mm-hmm.
dropped emissions, and and then like one at the bottom, I think peaked at 2030 and started coming back down. That was like their best case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went up to her afterwards and said, it looked like that peaked at 2030, but didn't the report that you all put out say that if emissions didn't peak by 2015 and start coming back down, that we wouldn't even recognize the planet? She's like, yeah, that's right. I said, so what am I missing here?
Mm-hmm.
She said, you're not missing anything. She said, there were things we could have done in the 80s and things we could have done in the 90s, but I'm sorry, my generation failed yours. And, that was a tough blow for me. Like she had literally just won the Nobel Prize at that point, for that climate report. And she was saying like, sorry, it's too late. Your future's screwed. And what that did for me was put me into a period of grieving for the loss of a lot of the future stability that I had hoped for my life.
Mm-hmm.
And what it meant was also grieving for a lot of the things that could be taken away from me by the legal system, by a lot of the things that are the costs of taking radical action, the personal costs. those were the things that I'd already grieved the loss of when Terry Root was honest enough with me to
Hmm.
tell me like how late in the game we really were.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a rare thing then, and unfortunately it's continued to be a rare thing
Yeah.
for the last 14 years since then.
Yeah.
Where in their public statements, scientists, activists, a lot of people working on climate change are just sugarcoating it because the instructions that they're given by like climate communications specialists, like Yale Climate Communications, is like you don't want to scare people. That doesn't motivate people.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've continued to engage in a level of action that is not actually appropriate for the point of the crisis that we're at, because we haven't really been honest with each other about it. And I think the other thing that goes on a lot in the climate movement is this sort of historical amnesia about our own movement
Hmm.
that that loves to erase the history of what happened, even 5, 10, 15 years ago, that in order to kind of pretend like what we're doing right now, this campaign, or these strategies or these tactics, are groundbreaking, and so they have a chance of working. Like if we're, occupying the office of this legislator or this governor, like we're going to tell ourselves that it's the first time that this has ever been done,
Hmm.
or this day of youth climate action, we're going to tell ourselves that this is the first or the biggest day of youth climate action ever, even when that's clearly not true. Like the way the Sunrise Movement like erases the history of the I Matter movement,
Mm-hmm.
and and I think again that's kind of an attempt to like give people hope and give people motivation, but what it ends up doing in a lot of cases, I think, is motivating people and giving them hope towards a strategy that has proven to fail many times over in this
Mm-hmm.
movement. That and so we see these cycles where people engage in these legal advocacy channels, and then hit the wall and figure out that system is rigged, and then they start protesting more and doing more nonviolent direct action, and then find that system is rigged against them as well, and that there's a limit of what can be achieved there, and are pushed into something more radical. We saw that with the generation of old environmental activists from the 70s, that people like Dave Foreman, that worked in DC lobbying and then ended up starting Earth
Mm-hmm.
First, and then the wave of folks in the 80s and 90s that saw the professionalization of the environmental movement, and then ended up getting into ELF and ALF and organizations like that. And I think we're probably on the cusp of it again with a generation of folks like the Sunrise Movement that has, worked so hard to work within the system and even incorporated protest into what they were doing in a more confrontational way than the generation of lobbyists before them, and have been sold out by the Democrats and sold out by Joe Biden, in the same way that the generation of climate activists before them were.
Yeah.
And I think a good number of them will turn to more radical action, because when you actually understand the severity of climate change, you're not just going to give up on your future.
It is still interesting to me that you talk about these cycles. You were galvanized in part by that sort of honest conversation that you had, but it's like you said, it's 14 years later, right? And we haven't seen that cycle turn yet. It still surprises me. I'll just say it surprises me we haven't seen more of it. And maybe it's sometimes I think about it as, and I think we need to be clear about where we're talking about too, because I still think that there's a level of comfort that we have. I mean, there are obviously lots of cases of environmental, more aggressive environmental related, sabotage efforts that have happened, in other parts of the world, right? When it really has
Yeah.
come down to, this is literally my livelihood or my life right now, or the land that's sacred to my people. And I
Right.
think maybe
Yeah,
we haven't hit that point yet.
just saw it in Canada
Right.
last week. With a group that was, supposedly armed with axes, according to the pipeline company that came in and smashed up a bunch of equipment. And it at this point like looks a little bit suspicious, but it's more direct and severe property damage than we often see, at least on this continent.
So yeah, so what are your views then on destruction of property as a point of intervention, on actually going after pipelines or other forms of infrastructure? And do you see it as inevitable? Do you see it as an important part of like a set of strategies? Like, sort of, what are your views on this?
I do more and more see it as important, and necessary, and I think we're in a different moment of opportunity now, where the severity of climate change is more deeply understood by a greater portion of our population, and where the context around movements in general has shifted quite a bit. When Elf was, burning down some stuff in the West in the 1990s, like that was considered pretty radical by people. But in the summer of 2020, when the Black Lives Matter movement was sweeping the country, there were buildings that caught fire. Let's just say that there were fires that happened in the vicinity of those protests, and it did very little to undermine their public credibility. Everybody, on the left side of the political spectrum was still very clear that they support the Black Lives Matter movement, even though there was some property damage associated with some of their actions, and there was obviously criticism from the right on that, but then not much more than 6 months later, the right was engaging in property damage at the Capitol building on January 6th, and in fact engaging in deadly violence against human beings.
And now calling it a peaceful demonstration, right? After the fact.
Right, legitimate political expression, according to the RNC. So that context, I think, has shifted a lot in this country, where people are so keenly aware that the system is broken that they're willing to embrace more radical action.
I want to talk about. I really want to get your thoughts on what we've been seeing in Canada, but I'm just curious about this point of. You talked earlier about the impact of nonviolent direct action being much more minimal now than when you became sort of famous for what you did, and therefore the idea of using it as a tool of public consciousness, right, is it's not as effective anymore. So when it comes to actually destruction of property, kind of ramping it up and sabotage, is it about, in your view, about now having a different narrative, still focused on that public consciousness piece, or is it more about like, forget the public conversation, this is actually about doing damage to the infrastructure of the fossil fuel machine that's sending us over the precipice?
I think it could be both. I think there's still a lot of potential for sabotage to have a big impact on the public narrative. One of the things that Andreas Malm talks about in his book is kind of using sabotage strategically to help frame the narrative. Particularly about the outsized emissions of the concentrated wealth of the 1%. And he talks about things like sabotaging private jets, which are like the ultimate symbol of excess consumption and excess wealth. That makes it clear like what the battle lines are, and is much more inclusive in kind of drawing those battle lines. That that addressing climate change isn't about getting our random middle class neighbors to change their lives, or about shaming them because they're driving to work. It's first and foremost about reining in the extreme wealth of the rich. And so like ever since I read that, I've been fantasizing about that, and and I think that could be incredibly powerful, and could disrupt some of the greenwashing narratives. You could just imagine at the next COP UN climate gathering that has been a facade for 26 years, keeping the climate movement playing these games that never had the potential to go anywhere. You could imagine the next one of those with all of the global elites that come in there to lobby and to sway the system. If a bunch of their private jets lined up at the airport were all sabotaged or blown up or whatever, or they're parked on the tarmac, that would change the narrative, both about climate action, about the carbon consumption of the elites, and about the kind of fake greenwashing of the UN process. So there's a lot of potential there. But I think in other parts of the fossil fuel economy, it really could be about just the direct impact. Whether that's fossil fuel shipments by rail, where sabotage can be extremely effective at disrupting the fossil fuel economy there. Even things like the valve turners actions that shut off the tar sands pipelines coming across the border from Canada. There's lots of opportunities there to escalate that tactic, to make it harder for them to turn them back on. And I think also in the coal economy that is like seeing a resurgence in this country over the past year, there's lots of opportunities for sabotage to have a big impact. And we've seen a little bit with like Jessica Resnicek that sabotaged the pipeline for Keystone XL, or for the Dakota Access pipeline rather. She chose to make that public well after the fact. But she could have easily just kept quiet about it. And, I think there's lots more opportunities there to have a serious direct impact on the industry, which then makes them less financially viable. Already the protests against new pipelines and new fossil fuel infrastructure is costing them enough delays that it's becoming a questionable investment by, you know, the banks and financial institutions that fund them. And so any push over the edge there can have a big impact. So yeah, I think there's lots of opportunities.
What about, so we've seen the situation in Canada, right, with the protests there, putting aside their grievances and the politics of it. Has the climate movement done anything on any level that's been close to that successful in terms of disrupting the machinery of an economy or changing the public narrative?
No, I don't
So
think
are there
so.
lessons to be learned
You know,
there?
I mean,
I mean,
I've,
and what would those be, you think?
yeah, I mean, I've been a part of organizing efforts that, wanted to paralyze a city that effectively. That, tried to do, an occupation or intersection shutdowns in DC and that sort of thing. And really came nowhere close. Um, and part of it is the willingness of American police to just, arrest arrest us all on the spot, and not indulge the way that the Canadian authorities indulged the trucker protest. Part of it is also obviously the physical efficacy of having tractor trailers and large trucks
Yeah.
that are harder to get out of the way. But yeah, I think that's in some ways an example. I think unfortunately there has been an effort on the left to kind of demonize what's been going on with truckers in Canada, and even in otherwise activist supporting publications like Truth Out, that are writing editorials saying that, those are not protesters, those are fascists that are threatening democracy, and, are like cheering on the fact that the government is freezing the bank accounts of nonviolent protesters that are disrupting economic activity, and even freezing the bank accounts of people who financially support the blockaders.
Or just are suspected of it, right?
And
And giving the banks basically cover to freeze anybody they suspect. Right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And how anybody on the left thinks that that's not going to get turned around and used against us is just absurd. Like I think right now we should be, well, like regardless of whether or not we agree with the truckers, we should be defending their right to protest in that way.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the things I was really concerned about and wanted to get your take on, is that shouldn't we anticipate that kind of draconian overreach on the part of governments if people are doing anything that is meaningfully disruptive, right, to an economy?
Yeah.
And how do you prepare for something like that, and the other thing I guess I was curious to get your thoughts on is, I guess I don't want to put it on a spectrum of escalation, but if we talk about just making clear distinctions between sort of nonviolent direct action that's, let's say, largely symbolic, right? And then there's sabotage of property infrastructure that might be symbolic or might be about a public narrative, but it might also actually do something meaningful to disrupt either the bottom line of fossil fuel companies or somehow impact, emissions on some level. And then there's actual violence against people, right? Which I don't know of anyone
Hmm.
that's advocating for that. But I do wonder if, we've talked about why we haven't seen kind of the second one on that spectrum, right? We haven't seen more of that kind of sabotage piece. Do we also have to be concerned about at some point seeing actual violence happening as people feel more and more acutely that their existence is threatened by the climate crisis? And what do we who might not advocate for that need to do to prepare for the the pushback or the blowback to either of those things, right? Yeah,
Hmm.
curious if you've thought about that and what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's something to be concerned about in the longer run. Um, you know, in in Kim Stanley Robinson's I don't know if it's his newest novel, but The Ministry
Yeah.
of the Future. Um, it's sort of a it's largely like a technocratic utopian view of like the messy best case scenario at this point for climate change. Even that still includes where like a big part of what created the opportunity for that like technocratic solutions to be
Mm.
implemented um, was a much more radical level um, of not just sabotage, but a group that took down a whole bunch of jets on one day, with people in them. A lot of people died in that turned the tide against air travel, and even their like technocratic Ministry of the Future division had a black ops wing, a dark wing that was assassinating key people in the fossil fuel industry and lobbyists and things like that. Um, so um, like that's kind of out there, and in some ways, it's yeah, as Andreas Malm points out in his book, it's rather remarkable that the climate movement and the environmental movement, out of which a lot of the climate movement grew, never has gone there. It's remarkable that this movement of tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people over the course of 50 years um, has never killed anyone. Um,
I mean, you could say,
which I don't think there's
would you say Kaczynski was?
I don't think there's another movement that
Yeah,
could say that.
that's true. Certainly, as a movement, maybe there have been individuals, who have done things. Yeah, I agree with I
Hmm.
agree with your point, for sure.
And I think like that's partly because of the the underlying values um, of the root environmentalism that I think is rooted in um, an understanding of the interdependence of all life and respect for all life. And so I think in terms of preparing ourselves for the possibility of that violence against humans happening, I think um, holding on to those values, upholding those values, reinforcing them, um, you know, and continuing to have that be a core part of what motivates us um, is going to be extremely important
Hmm.
for that. Um, you know that um, that as we escalate into property damage, I think it becomes ever more important that um, we always remind ourselves that we are acting out of defense of life and in respect for all life,
Do you do you feel like the
and
climate?
that we're not.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, do you feel like the climate movement uh, is is grappling with this question of how do we, if not even embrace destruction of property, but how do we prepare for the likelihood of destruction of property and what it might mean for the success of the movement? Like, because for example, I think that there's,
No, I don't think they're
yeah,
grappling with that at all.
but there's a big difference in how these things are
They
being
should be.
done, right? Like, for example, XR,
Yeah.
Extinction Rebellion, disrupting trains, in London, people just trying to get to work.
Hmm.
Bad optics.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? I mean, here's public
Yeah.
transit, and the people who are being affected here are people who are just trying to get to work and can't afford to miss out. So it does seem like, and again, I'm not an activist organizer, but it does seem like how things are done makes a big difference in terms of how the public narrative is shaped. And some people are going to call people terrorists no matter what. People who are trying to continue
Right.
to propagate, the system as it currently stands, right? But they'll come up with any excuse they want. To me, it's
Hmm.
about the sort of the general public and what resonates for them. And part of my concern
Right.
is that, I mean, you talked about earlier about you know, the cost of doing business for the fossil fuel companies becoming increasingly more severe, right? And that they could actually
Hmm.
have doing, actions against pipelines or other forms of infrastructure could actually have a real meaningful financial impact on them. At the same time, we're dealing with inflationary pressures around energy prices, for example. And we could have a bigger conversation about, the challenges we're going to have with like shutting down fossil fuel infrastructure and the challenge of replacing it with renewables certainly seamlessly, right? So just worry
Hmm.
about there being a big blowback if, you know, prices are already spiking or there could be issues. I mean, we have issues now in Europe with shortages of natural gas, for example, that people are dependent on. People take action, do you know what I mean? And then are they being the ones blamed for this, you know? So I worry that the climate movement is not planning for that kind of reaction or response.
Right. And that's why, I think with stuff where there's the opportunity for a powerful positive impact on the cultural narrative, like going
Mm.
after private jets or something, I think it makes sense to kind of speak up about that afterwards. But with the other side of the coin, where I was talking about, it's just about having a financial impact on the industry. Um, I think uh, in a lot of cases it doesn't make sense to
Hmm.
take credit for that. Um, just like let it be the
Hmm.
industry's cost. Um, you know, they don't necessarily want to come out and say like, hey, somebody did this thing to sabotage our equipment. Here's what they did. Um, because they don't want to like publicly admit those vulnerabilities. Um, and and so it's just kind of like quietly their cost, and that's part of the lesson of some of the earlier chapters of Sabotage, like Elf and Alf, um, is that trying to kind of straddle that public narrative of like taking credit for it with anonymous communiques, that really
Hmm.
backfires. Like if there's not a face for somebody to associate with, if there's not somebody who can publicly come out and say, this is what I did and this is why, it's better to not
Hmm.
say anything at all. Like don't like create that public drama, um, and then just kind of hand the platform to our opponents in industry to
Hmm.
frame the narrative. Um, that in some ways the the narrative effort has to kind of be all or nothing. Like if we're not um, willing to like fully step up and own it, um, just quietly do it. And and there is a lot of that stuff that happens,
Hmm.
on a small scale, um, that we don't hear about because the industry doesn't want to talk about it.
Hmm.
Um, and then that's where there is that potential where we can be racking up their costs, and as far as the public is concerned, it's just their costs. Um, it's just their fault.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And then maybe if it does come to acts of sabotage that are being done for that public narrative, I hear you saying really fully own it and try to own the narrative, but also be pretty strategic about what those actions are and the target of
Right,
those actions.
right.
Yeah, and I'm not sure
Yep.
what to say about, you know, I do think that on some level it's useful to have this conversation just from the standpoint of I don't see it very top of mind. I appreciated Malm writing that book just from the standpoint of trying to engender more of a conversation about this because I've not seen, not only have I not seen much action like he's been calling for, but I've not even seen much conversation about it. And so I think the more discussion people are having
Yeah.
about whether they're in favor of this, whether they're going to participate in this or not, just recognizing that I think it's
Right.
inevitable and trying to think about how to anticipate it, how to help think about more effective ways of it happening, and to anticipate the blowback, which I'm really concerned about, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that conversation is not going to happen within the
Mm-hmm.
established climate movement and within any established climate organizations. There's just too much professionalism. Like any organization that is in the climate funding pipeline, of foundation grants and that sort of thing, is not going to lead or take part
Mm-hmm.
in that discussion. Um, but like frankly, I think that part of the movement has kind of reached the limits of what it can accomplish anyway. Um, I think in general we need to be starting from scratch, and um, and work completely outside of
Mm-hmm.
established movement culture. Um, but I think there are a lot of people out there that are kind of connecting the dots of where we're at, and are probably ready to do sabotage, um, and ready to support it when other people do it. Um, and I think that conversation has to happen in a organic grassroots kind of way, um, outside of the established narrative, because you know they the established groups have the narrative that works for them, and they control the channels of communication for
Mm-hmm.
for their little ecosystem, um, to silence other discourse. And at the time when I disrupted the auction, that's what was happening around civil disobedience and nonviolent direct action within the established climate movement. Was like they were controlling their part of the conversation to to make sure that didn't get brought up. Um, but I found there were lots of people that weren't in that established movement, um, that were deeply concerned about climate change and ready for more radical action. And I think we're still at that point,
Mm-hmm.
even more so
Are you
than
seeing
ever
signs
before.
of hope for and the emergence of either new groups or new ways of organizing that's outside of that established climate movement?
Um, I don't know. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not sure I'm plugged in enough to see that. Um, I guess I'm confident or have faith that is happening at
Yeah.
some level under the surface. That those connections are happening. I think some of the big convergences in action camps, and particularly the indigenous-led camps like at Standing Rock, and then more recently at Line 3. There was a lot of that happening, at an organic level. A lot of relationships get formed when people are there for, months at a time. And so I think that's going to be really generative. There was kind of an explosion of creativity and boldness that came out of Standing Rock. And I think we're right on the cusp of seeing that come out of the Line 3 encampments.
Yeah.
So I know that it's happening.
Well, Tim, thank you for kind of exploring some of these questions with me. It does feel like it's an area for people to keep their eyes and ears peeled to. I think we're going to probably be seeing these kinds of conversations happening more and more, and probably seeing more actions that test,
Hope so.
that test us and maybe push people to think about what needs to be done and how we can support things. So, thanks a lot.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being willing to have the conversation.